The first pearl struck the marble floor with a sound so small Eleanor almost believed no one had heard it. Then came the second. And the third. A sharp snap brushed against her neck. Before she could even lift a hand, the strand broke entirely. White pearls scattered across the ballroom floor of Blackthorn Hall, rolling beneath polished shoes and silk hems as gasps spread through the Duke's grand banquet. For one terrible second, the music continued. Then someone laughed. "Oh dear," a woman whispered far too loudly, pressing her fan to her lips. "Her pearls have come apart." Eleanor Ashcombe dropped to her knees, heat flooding her face. Her trembling fingers rushed to gather the beads before anyone noticed. But it was already too late. A pearl rolled across the polished ballroom floor. Before Eleanor could reach for it, a gentleman stepped backward without looking. A sharp crack echoed softly beneath his polished shoe. The room stilled. The gentleman frowned and lifted his foot. What remained of the pearl had shattered. A faint chalky powder marked the marble. Someone near the supper table gave a startled laugh. "Oh!" Another guest leaned closer. "Good heavens," a woman whispered. "They are false." The whisper spread faster than the music. Fake pearls? At the Duke's banquet? How embarrassing. Eleanor's breath caught. Across the room, Clara lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Lydia suddenly found great interest in the musicians. And in that terrible moment, Eleanor understood. She wanted nothing more than to disappear. To leave the ballroom. To flee the hundreds of eyes staring at her. But before she could rise, the room changed. The laughter stopped. Conversation faded. Even the musicians faltered. Someone was crossing the ballroom. Slowly. Deliberately. And when a pair of polished black boots stopped directly before her, no one dared speak. Because only one man in the room could silence an entire banquet simply by moving. The Duke himself. And instead of walking past her like everyone expected, he bent down. Then quietly said the last thing Eleanor Ashcombe ever expected to hear that night. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, holding out his hand. "May I have the first dance?" But 3 hours earlier, Eleanor had nearly decided not to attend the Duke's banquet at all. Chapter 1: The Girl No One Sees. She did not haunt the house like a ghost. She worked it. Every morning before the housemaids had lit the first fire, Eleanor Ashcombe was already moving through the cold corridors of Ashcombe Hall, the house that bore her family's name, the house her father had built, the house that no longer belonged to her in any way that mattered. She dusted the frames of portraits she had once played beneath as a child. She arranged flowers in vases her mother had chosen decades ago. She kept the household accounts with careful, precise handwriting, because if she did not do it, no one would, and because Lady Marwick had made it perfectly clear that usefulness was the only currency Eleanor had left. Her father had been dead for 3 years. 3 years was long enough to learn exactly what kind of woman her stepmother was. Lady Marwick did not hate Eleanor, not precisely. Hatred would have required a certain amount of energy, and Lady Marwick preferred to spend her energy on things that amused her, her daughters, her social calendar, and the very careful management of who in London knew what about the Ashcombe family finances. Eleanor simply inconvenienced her. A reminder of a first wife. A mouth to feed that produced no profitable marriage prospects. A shadow in a house that Lady Marwick wished to fill only with light, her own kind of light. So Eleanor wore her old gowns. She mended her own gloves, small careful stitches along the left ring finger where the fabric had worn thin. She smiled at the right moments and stayed silent at the ones that mattered, and she had become so skilled at making herself invisible that some mornings she looked into the mirror and was almost surprised to find a reflection looking back. She was 22 years old. She felt considerably older. It was on a grey Tuesday morning that the letter arrived, thick cream paper, sealed in black wax, pressed with the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Blackthorn. The banquet invitations for the season had come. Clara found hers at the breakfast table and screamed, the high, delighted kind of scream that made the footman by the door flinch. Lydia snatched her own envelope and tore it open with no patience for elegance, reading aloud before she had even finished unfolding the paper. Eleanor had no envelope. She had not expected one. She poured her tea and said nothing, which was the appropriate response to most things in this house, and watched her half-sisters dissolve into the particular kind of frenzy that only a duke's invitation could produce. The Duke of Blackthorn's banquet was not simply a party. It was, as every unmarried woman in London understood, a selection. The Duke, young, titled, extraordinarily wealthy, and by all accounts deeply private, hosted exactly one formal event per season. Those who attended were seen. Those who were seen had a chance. Those who had a chance sometimes changed their lives entirely. Clara already had the gown she intended to wear. Lydia was prepared to commission another. Lady Marwick swept into the room, read both invitations, and smiled the slow, satisfied smile of a woman who believed her investment was about to pay. None of them looked at Eleanor. She finished her tea and rose from the table quietly, the way she always did. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Eleanor has spent 3 years making herself small in her own home. She's learned to expect nothing. But here's what I want you to think about. Do you believe Eleanor has truly accepted her situation, or do you think, underneath that quiet dignity, something in her is still waiting? Hold that thought. Because the next part of this story depends entirely on that answer. It was Lydia who suggested it first. Eleanor should come. The room went still in a way that felt rehearsed. Clara turned from the mirror with an expression of sudden, generous consideration, the performance of a woman who has practiced kindness without ever quite learning it. Yes, she said slowly, as though the idea were only just occurring to her. Why shouldn't she? It would be terribly unkind to leave her behind. Lady Marwick said nothing. Which, Eleanor had long ago learned, was its own kind of answer. Eleanor looked at her half-sisters and understood, with the particular, exhausting clarity of someone who has been underestimated for years, exactly what this was. They wanted her there. Beside them. A comparison. A contrast. Clara in her ice-blue silk and Lydia in her rose satin, and Eleanor in whatever sad assemblage she could manage, standing proof of what a woman looked like when fortune and favor had looked away. She should have declined. She knew that. Thank you, she said instead. I would be glad to attend. The pearls appeared the following morning. Lydia set them on Eleanor's dressing table without ceremony, a single strand of creamy white beads on a thin silver clasp, coiled like something sleeping. They're lovely, Lydia said. And honestly, they suit you. Very, understated. Eleanor picked them up. They were light, far lighter than they should have been. She pressed one bead carefully between her fingers and felt the faint give of glass beneath painted lacquer. Fake. Of course they were fake. She set them down on the velvet of her dressing table and looked at them for a long moment. She had no other jewels. Her mother's pearls, the real ones, a double strand with a diamond clasp, had disappeared from the household inventory approximately 4 months after her father's funeral. Eleanor had never asked where they had gone. She already knew the answer would be a lie, and she had not wanted to spend the anger it would cost her. She picked up the false pearls and fastened them around her neck. That evening, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her cream gown, the one she had let out slightly at the seams last winter, and pressed herself that afternoon, smoothing each pleat with the kind of attention most women gave to gowns that cost a fortune. The pearl sat at her throat. Cold. Weightless. Wrong. She looked at herself for a long time. The woman in the mirror had tired eyes and good posture and a mouth that had learned not to say most of what it thought. She was not, by any account, what this season was looking for. But she was still here. One evening, Eleanor said quietly to her reflection, her voice barely above a whisper. You only have to survive one evening. She picked up her mended gloves from the dressing table. And she put them on. One evening. That was all she was asking for. But the Duke of Blackthorn's banquet had a way of changing the people who walked through its doors. And Eleanor Ashcombe, invisible, overlooked, wearing glass pearls and a mended gown, was about to become impossible to ignore. Chapter 2: The Weight of Candlelight. Blackthorn Hall did not welcome you. It assessed you. That was the feeling Eleanor had the moment the carriage turned through the iron gates and the house came into view, vast and pale against the night sky, every window blazing with light, the kind of light that was not meant to warm but to illuminate. To show things clearly. To leave nowhere to hide. She had heard people describe it as magnificent. Standing before it now, she thought relentless was the more honest word. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire upper floor of Ashcombe House. Marble floors the color of winter ice. Candelabras that rose taller than men. And everywhere, the guests. London's finest, dressed in the full armor of their wealth and station. Silk that caught the light. Jewels that threw it back. Smiles that meant nothing and cost everything. Eleanor stepped inside. And the house looked at her, the way houses like this always did, measuring the cut of her gown, the age of her gloves, the modest strand of pearls at her throat, and found her wanting. She already knew. She kept walking anyway. Clara and Lydia moved through the room the way water moves downhill, naturally, inevitably, towards wherever the light was brightest and the most important people were standing. Eleanor followed for exactly 4 minutes. That was how long it took for her sisters to be absorbed into a glittering cluster of young women near the east wall, laughing at something Eleanor hadn't heard, turning slightly inward the way a group does when it is deciding, without words, who belongs and who does not. Clara glanced back once. She did not beckon. Eleanor stopped walking and understood, with perfect clarity and no surprise at all, that she was on her own. She found a quiet position near one of the long windows, close enough to the room to appear present, far enough from its center to avoid drawing attention. It was a skill she had refined over 3 years of Lady Marwick's dinner parties, the art of occupying space without claiming it. She watched. That, at least, she was good at. Before we go further, I need you to picture this room with me. Hundreds of candles. The low pull of a string quartet. The smell of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, and underneath it all, faintly, the cold stone of a very old house. And somewhere in that room, a man everyone is watching, and pretending not to watch. What do you imagine a man like the Duke of Blackthorn looks like when he thinks no one is paying attention to him? Hold that image. You may find you're right. She noticed him before she was told who he was. That was the thing about the Duke of Blackthorn, he required no announcement, no gesturing, no whispered identification from a woman behind a fan. He simply stood in a room differently from other men, the way a load-bearing wall stands differently from decorative ones. Everything around him continued its motion, conversation, laughter, the careful choreography of people trying to impress each other, and he was still. Not uncomfortable. Not aloof, exactly. Simply present in a way that most people were not. He was taller than Eleanor had expected. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in black with the kind of simplicity that announced, very quietly, that he had nothing to prove. His face was composed into an expression she could only describe as watchful, not cold, not warm, but attentive in the way of a man who had learned that rooms like this one told the truth, if you knew how to read them. He was speaking to no one. He was watching everyone. And he very rarely smiled. The whispers began approximately 20 minutes into the evening. Eleanor heard the first one from 2 women to her left, neither of whom had bothered to lower their voices to a register that couldn't carry. Is that a Marwick girl? The pale one by the window? The unfortunate one, yes. The stepdaughter. From the first marriage. A pause. The soft percussion of fans opening. Those pearls are remarkably white. Too white. Too perfect. You can always tell, can't you, when a woman is trying too hard with too little? Eleanor kept her eyes on the middle distance. Her expression did not change. She had learned, a long time ago, that the face was the only territory she could fully control in rooms like this one, and she controlled it now with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that showing pain was simply giving people what they wanted. She breathed. She watched. She stayed still. It was an accident that changed the evening's geometry. An elderly woman, small, white-haired, navigating the edge of the room with the careful dignity of someone whose bones had begun to make negotiation difficult, caught the edge of a chair with her sleeve. The handkerchief she had been holding dropped to the floor and was immediately lost beneath the shuffle of passing feet and the general indifference of a room that was looking elsewhere. No one stopped. Not the young couple nearest her. Not the footman who passed within arm's reach. Not the cluster of women who saw it happen and resumed their conversation without missing a single word. Eleanor crossed the room in 12 steps, retrieved the handkerchief from beneath the edge of a chair, and returned it without ceremony, a small, quiet exchange that required nothing and meant everything to the woman who received it. She turned back towards the window. And found, for one suspended moment, that someone was watching her. Dark eyes. Still face. The Duke of Blackthorn looked at Eleanor Ashcombe the way she had watched him, not with admiration, not with interest, but with the careful, considered attention of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. Then someone spoke to him, and the moment closed. Eleanor returned to her window and told herself it meant nothing. It was Clara who found her 40 minutes later. "You're hiding," she said brightly, which in Clara's language meant I have something planned and you are part of it. "I'm resting," Eleanor said. "Come." Clara's hand was already at her elbow, light, gracious, the perfect performance of a loving sister. "You can't spend the whole evening against the wall. People will think you're miserable." She steered Eleanor towards the center of the ballroom with the focused intention of someone moving a piece into position. The room opened around them. Heads turned, that small, involuntary social motion, the instinct to look when something is being presented. And Eleanor felt it at once, the way the air changed, the way conversations dimmed at the edges. She was in the light now, the full light, and there was nothing between her and the judgment of 200 people who had already decided what they thought of her before she had spoken a single word. The remarks were not even hidden anymore. Those pearls. That gown, is that cream or has it simply aged that way? She carries herself well enough. Pity about the rest. Clara smiled at someone across the room. Lydia appeared at Eleanor's other side, completing the arrangement with the naturalness of long practice. Eleanor stood between her sisters like a floor displayed in a jeweller's window, present, deliberate, and meant to make everything beside her look more brilliant by contrast. She would not look down. She would not look down. She began moving towards the side corridor at the edge of the ballroom with no announcement and no explanation, simply the quiet, controlled motion of a woman who has calculated the exact angle of exit least likely to draw notice. She had almost reached it. Lydia's hand closed around her arm. Not roughly. That was never how it was done in rooms like this. Lydia held her with the light, unyielding grip of a woman who had learned that cruelty, properly applied, looked indistinguishable from affection. "You can't leave yet," Lydia said softly, smiling at a passing couple as she spoke. "The evening hasn't even started." Eleanor looked at her. "In fact," Lydia continued, her voice low and pleasant and perfectly calibrated, "I think it's just about to become very interesting." She did not release her grip. Very interesting. 2 words. And Eleanor Ashcombe, who had survived 3 years of quiet cruelty and learned to expect the worst from people who smiled while delivering it, felt, for the first time that evening, something she had not permitted herself all night. Fear. Not of the room. not of the whispers of whatever her sister had arranged. Chapter 3: What the Floor Reveals. It happened quickly. The way disasters always do, not with warning, not with ceremony, but with one small, ordinary motion that changes everything that follows. Dinner had ended. The guests had drifted back into the ballroom in that particular post-supper current, warmed by wine and the comfortable cruelty of an evening going well. The quartet had resumed. Candles had been refreshed. The room had that heightened quality it gets in the second half of a grand evening, when guards are lowered and the performance becomes, for a few dangerous hours, almost real. Eleanor had almost made it to the edge. Clara stepped into her path. It looked like an accident. It was meant to look like an accident, that was the artistry of it, the thing Eleanor could only admire even as it destroyed her. Clara turned with the glass in her hand, laughing at something behind her, and her arm swung out in that wide, careless arc, and her fingers caught the strand at Eleanor's throat. The clasp, cheap, thin, designed for a necklace that had never been intended to last, gave without resistance. The strand snapped. And the pearls fell. Sound, Eleanor would remember later, was the strangest part of it. The way the music seemed to dim before it actually stopped. The way the first few pearls struck the marble and rang out, small, clear, impossibly loud, in the half-second before anyone understood what was happening. The way the conversation nearest her died first, then rippled outward, silence spreading across the ballroom like something dropped into still water. She stood very still. For 3 full seconds, she simply stood there, and the pearls rolled across the floor in every direction, some gathering in the grouting between marble tiles, some spinning outward into the crowd, one striking the heel of a woman's slipper and veering sharply left, and Eleanor watched them go with the particular stillness of a person whose mind has not yet decided how to respond to catastrophe. Then she did the thing that sealed it. She knelt. She did not think about it. There was no calculation, no dignity assessment, no moment of internal debate. She simply went down to the floor the way you reach for something falling before you understand you are reaching, instinct, not choice, and began gathering the pearls with both hands. The first man who noticed stepped forward, picked one up with 2 fingers, and held it out to her with the expression of someone performing a small, distasteful duty. And then another pearl was stepped on. The crack was quiet. Barely a sound at all. But the marble was unforgiving, and the bead split cleanly, and the interior, chalky, pale, the unmistakable grey-white of cheap glass composite, was suddenly and completely visible. The man holding the other pearl looked at it differently now. He pressed it gently between his fingers, the way Eleanor had pressed it on her dressing table 2 days ago, and felt exactly what she had felt. He set it down on the floor without giving it back. The whispers came the way cold comes through a window, gradual, then total. They're not real. Paste. Look at the inside. She wore fake pearls. To Blackthorn's banquet. How absolutely. And then laughter. Not loud. That would have been almost kinder. Instead it was the particular laughter of a room that has agreed, without speaking, on what something means, low, controlled, passed from person to person like a note folded very small. Eleanor was still on her knees. She looked up. Clara was 4 feet away, one hand raised to her mouth, her eyes bright with the effort of containing a smile. Lydia had turned sideways, presenting Eleanor with the clean architecture of her profile, the deliberate blankness of a woman establishing, for the record, that she had no connection to what was happening on the floor beside her. They had known. Of course they had known. Eleanor understood, in one clear, terrible moment, the full shape of it, the invitation extended with false warmth, the pearls offered with false generosity, the position in the center of the ballroom arranged with precise, careful cruelty. Not a spontaneous humiliation. A constructed one. Planned in the privacy of Ashcombe House and executed here, in the most important room in London, in front of everyone who mattered. She was kneeling among broken, false pearls, and the room was laughing, and she was entirely alone. She did not cry. She would not cry. But she felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders with a permanence that frightened her, the sense that this moment, this image, would follow her out of this room and into every room that came after. That this was the story London would tell about Eleanor Ashcombe. The girl with the fake pearls. On her knees at Blackthorn's banquet. Didn't you hear? Where most people in that room did look away. Do you think Eleanor, in this moment, wanted to be saved, or did she want, more than anything, simply not to be seen? Because what happens next is not quite either. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, he had not spoken yet. She heard his movement. The particular quality of a room-changing posture, the way 200 people adjusted their weight and their attention simultaneously, drawn by something they could not have named but could not ignore. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Not the way it had spread, outward, quiet, unstoppable. It stopped the way a candle stops when you put your hand around the flame. All at once. Complete. Eleanor looked up. The Duke of Blackthorn was crossing the ballroom floor. Not quickly. Not with visible purpose, that was the thing that struck her, that would stay with her afterward. He was not striding to her rescue the way men strode in the story she had read as a girl. He was simply walking, with the same unhurried, self-possessed calm she had observed in him all evening, and the room was parting for him the way water parts for something that does not slow down. He reached her. He looked at the scattered pearls for a moment. Then, without hesitation, without the smallest alteration in his expression, the Duke of Blackthorn went down on one knee beside her. The room went very still. He picked up one of the broken beads. Turned it once in his fingers. Then he looked up at the assembled company of London's finest, all those silk gowns, all those real jewels, all those cold, watching eyes, and he said, in a voice that was perfectly level and absolutely carrying, "Strange. I had thought refinement required better manners than this." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. He set the broken pearl down with the quiet finality of a man closing a door, and he turned to Eleanor, and he extended his hand. "Miss Ashcombe." His voice was different now, lower, directed only at her. "Would you do me the honor of the first dance?" She nearly said no. That was the truth of it, the part of the story that no one watching from the outside could have known. For one full second, Eleanor looked at his offered hand and felt not relief, not gratitude, but the sharp, instinctive suspicion of a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, that kindness in public always had a price. He is doing this because it costs him nothing, she thought. And because it costs me everything to refuse. She took his hand. She let him help her to her feet. And she walked with the Duke of Blackthorn onto the dance floor of his own banquet while the room watched in a silence so complete she could hear the candles. He danced well, which she had not expected. Controlled, precise, no wasted motion, the dancing of a man who had learned it as a discipline rather than a pleasure. "You think I pity you," he said, after the first turn. It was not a question. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. "Don't you?" No, he said it without inflection, without insistence, as though it were simply a correction of fact. Pity is what they felt before they laughed. "I felt something else." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured and entirely serious. "I watched you retrieve a handkerchief for a woman this room had decided not to see. I watched you stand in the center of this ballroom for 20 minutes while people said unkind things at a volume that was designed to be heard. And I watched you go to your knees on a marble floor and try to recover your dignity with both hands." A pause. 1, 2, 3 steps. "You showed more grace in that than most people in this room have managed all evening standing upright." Eleanor looked at him. Not the polite, careful look she had been giving people all night, the look she had learned to use in rooms like this one, the look that showed nothing. She actually looked at him. "That is either very kind," she said, or something you say to women you feel obligated to rescue. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not enough to be called that. But something. "I don't do things out of obligation, Miss Ashcombe," he said. "You will find, if you are around me long enough, that I do them or I don't." She believed him. That was the most unsettling part, how quickly, how completely she believed him. The dance ended. He returned her to the edge of the floor with the same unhurried composure with which he had crossed it, and he bowed correctly, and he stepped back. Eleanor turned to face the room, and found that it had changed. Not dramatically. Not the way rooms changed in stories, no spontaneous applause, no sudden reversal of fortune. But the quality of the attention directed at her was different now, and she felt it immediately, the way you feel a wind change before you see what it brings. They were not laughing. They were not whispering about paste pearls and mended gloves and women who didn't belong. They were simply watching her. With the careful, recalibrating attention of 200 people who had decided something an hour ago and were now, quietly and privately, reconsidering. Eleanor Ashcombe stood on the edge of the Duke of Blackthorn's ballroom floor in her repaired cream gown, with no pearls at her throat and no illusions left about the evening she had walked into. And for the first time since she had stepped through those doors, she was not trying to disappear. The room was watching her. Not the Duke. Not Clara. Not the broken pearls still scattered somewhere on that marble floor. Her. And Eleanor, who had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, had absolutely no idea what to do with that. Chapter 4: The Weight of Being Seen. London talked. That was the thing about this city, it never simply observed. It processed, interpreted, redistributed. By the morning after the Duke of Blackthorn's banquet, the story of Eleanor Ashcombe and the broken pearls had been told in at least 14 drawing rooms, 3 breakfast tables, and 1 letter sent express to a cousin in Bath. The versions varied. In some, Eleanor was pitiable, a poor relation caught in an embarrassing moment, rescued by a duke with an uncommonly developed sense of chivalry. In others, she was suspicious, a clever woman who had engineered her own humiliation with remarkable precision to catch the attention of the most eligible man in England. In a few, more generous ones, she was simply someone who had been treated badly in public and handled it with more composure than most people could have managed. What none of the versions could dispute, because all 200 guests had witnessed it, was the fact itself. The Duke of Blackthorn had crossed his own ballroom floor, knelt beside her, and asked her to dance. He had never done that for anyone. And London, which had spent years cataloguing everything the Duke had never done, understood perfectly well what that meant. Ashcombe House was not a peaceful place in the days that followed. Clara moved through it with the tight, over-controlled energy of a woman recalculating. Lydia was quieter, which was worse. Lydia's silences had texture to them, a quality of ongoing interior work that Eleanor had learned, over years of proximity, to find more alarming than any outburst. Lady Marwick called Eleanor into the morning room on the second day. The conversation was brief and specific. "You will not encourage this," Lady Marwick said, without preamble or softening. She was seated behind the writing desk, which Eleanor understood was a deliberate choice. The desk was a barrier and an elevation both. Whatever the Duke's reasons for his behavior at the banquet, you will not mistake a single act of courtesy for an invitation to pursue. "I have not pursued anything," Eleanor said. "You will ensure that remains true." Lady Marwick's eyes were steady and entirely cold. "A man of his position does not seriously consider a woman of yours. If you allow yourself to believe otherwise, the embarrassment that follows will be considerably worse than a few broken pearls." Eleanor looked at her stepmother and thought several things she did not say. "Of course," she said instead. She left the room. She had taken exactly 4 steps down the corridor when Clara appeared from the sitting-room doorway, with the timing of someone who had been waiting. "You planned it," Clara said. Not loudly. That was never how it was done in this house. The pearls, the kneeling, all of it. You wanted him to notice you. Eleanor stopped walking. You gave me paste beads and placed me in the center of that room, she said, very quietly. And then you're surprised by what happened. Clara's expression flickered, the smallest fracture, there and gone. He felt sorry for you, she said. That's all it was. Eleanor said nothing. She walked away. I want to stop here, because this moment matters. Eleanor has just been told, by her stepmother and by her sister, the same thing, that the Duke's attention is not real. That it is pity. Charity. A momentary impulse from a powerful man who will lose interest by Thursday. Do you think Eleanor believes them, or does she believe them because it is safer than hoping they are wrong? There is a difference. And that difference is everything. He came on a Thursday. Not with fanfare, not with a large retinue, a single card sent ahead by footman that morning, formal and correct, requesting the courtesy of a brief call if Miss Ashcombe was receiving. Eleanor had read it 3 times. Lady Marwick had read it once, gone very still, and then said nothing at all, which was its own extraordinary event. He arrived at precisely the stated hour, which Eleanor filed away as a detail that told her something. The drawing-room had been hastily made presentable. Clara and Lydia both appeared, dressed with a speed that suggested they had been prepared since breakfast. Lady Marwick stationed herself at the small writing table near the window with a piece of correspondence she was not reading. The Duke greeted the room with correct, impersonal courtesy. Then he produced, from his coat pocket, a small folded cloth. He held it out to Eleanor. She opened it. Inside, sitting against the white linen, was one of the broken pearls from the Banquet, split cleanly in half, its chalky interior facing upward. I thought you might want it back, he said. Or not. I wasn't certain. But it seemed wrong to leave it on the floor. The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the broken bead in her palm for a moment. Then she looked up. My sisters gave me that necklace, she said. It was not a sentence she had planned to say. It arrived fully formed from somewhere below deliberate thought, the way truth sometimes did when she was too tired to manage them properly. She was aware of Lady Marwick going still at the writing table. She was aware of Clara beside the fireplace drawing a short breath. She did not retract it. They told me the pearls were good enough for someone like me, she continued, her voice level. I suspected they were false. I wore them because I had nothing else. She was not asking for sympathy. Her voice carried no tremor, no invitation to comfort. She was simply stating facts. The way she kept the household accounts. Clearly, without embellishment, because accuracy mattered more than impression. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Thank you for telling me, he said. That was all. But something in the way he said it, the weight he put on thank you, as though honesty were a thing he had learned not to expect and still valued precisely because of that, settled somewhere in Eleanor's chest and stayed there. He called again the following week. And the week after that. The visits were always correct, never too long, never in private, always conducted within the full view of Lady Marwick's calculated observation and her sister's barely concealed surveillance. There was nothing that could be called improper. Nothing that gave London anything more than inference to work with. But inference, in London, was sufficient. Eleanor began to know him the way you learn a house you've been given careful access to, room by room, detail by detail, nothing offered faster than it was ready. She learned that he was quiet not from arrogance but from a genuine preference for substance over noise. That he had an exact, unsentimental intelligence that assessed situations rapidly and without flattery. That he was not, as society had decided, cold, but that he had spent enough years in rooms that rewarded performance over honesty that he had stopped performing, which some people mistook for coldness because warmth was the easiest performance to miss when it was absent. She saw him speak to her father's former footman, a man she had kept on when Lady Marwick had wanted him dismissed, with the same directness he used with his own staff. No condescension. No theatre. Simply a man addressing another man as though rank were a fact and not a verdict. She noticed that. He noticed her noticing. "You keep good people around you," he said, on his third visit. "I keep people around me," Eleanor said. "Whether they're considered good depends on who's doing the considering." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It does. I need to ask you something, because we're at the point in this story where everything could go either way. The Duke is not a man who does things carelessly. Eleanor is not a woman who mistakes attention for affection. They are both, in their separate ways, people who have learned to protect themselves with great precision. What do you think would frighten this Duke more, discovering he was wrong about Eleanor, or discovering he wasn't? Think about it. Because what happens next suggests he has been asking himself the same question. It was her mother's escritoire that broke the surface of what had remained unspoken. Eleanor had found it moved, pushed against the wall of the third guest room, buried under a dust sheet, its writing surface bare where the silver inkwell and the tortoiseshell letter opener had always Saturday. She knew without asking where those objects had gone. She had been watching her mother's possessions migrate out of the house for 2 years, a painted miniature removed from the hallway, a set of ivory hair combs that had vanished from the dressing table, a garnet brooch that Eleanor had last seen in Lydia's jewelry case. She had said nothing. Because saying something required proof, and proof required the kind of sustained confrontation that cost more energy than Eleanor had been willing to spend on things she could not change. But the Duke asked her once, quite directly, why she kept the accounts for a household in which she was not the mistress. "Because someone has to," she said. "And what do you find," he said carefully, "when you keep them?" Eleanor looked at him. She told him. Not everything. Not with bitterness, not with the jagged self-pity of someone wanting rescue. She told him the shape of it, plainly, the allowance redirected, the belongings liquidated, the small, methodical stripping of everything that had once connected her to her mother and her father's name. All of it funneled, quietly and consistently, toward Clara's wardrobe and Lydia's prospects and Lady Marwick's social machinery. The fake pearls had not been thoughtless cruelty. They had been a statement. A deliberate positioning of Eleanor, dressed in the proof of her own diminishment, in the most visible room in London. The Duke said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was entirely even. "That was not an accident at the banquet," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "It was engineered." "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. "I see," he said. Eleanor did not know, precisely, what he saw. But she had learned enough about this man, in these careful weeks, to understand that "I see" was not a meaningless thing for him to say. It meant he had filed the information somewhere it would not be lost. That it had changed the shape of something in his thinking. She was not sure whether that comforted or frightened her. What frightened her most, if she was being honest, and she had started being honest, which was its own kind of danger, was not his attention. It was that she had begun to trust it. That somewhere between the broken pearl returned in a folded cloth and the quiet conversation about her mother's escritoire, she had crossed an internal boundary she had not meant to cross. She was no longer simply enduring his visits with cautious gratitude. She was, in the private architecture of her own thoughts, waiting for them. That was new. That was, she told herself firmly, something to be managed. She did not manage it quickly enough. Clara came to her room on a Wednesday evening with the particular bright-eyed calm of a woman who has made a decision and is pleased with it. She sat on the edge of Eleanor's chair without being invited and said, very pleasantly, "Lady Forsyth is hosting a dinner assembly next Friday. We've all been invited." Eleanor said nothing. "The Duke will be there, I imagine." Clara examined her own fingernail with great interest. "Most of the same set from the banquet." "I'm sure it will be a pleasant evening," Eleanor said. Clara looked up. And the pleasantness in her expression sharpened, just slightly, at the edges. "People have been talking, you know," she said. About you and the Duke. About why someone like him would persist with someone like you. She paused. Some people have a theory. Do they? That you've been very deliberately presenting yourself as a victim, Clara said, soft and precise as a blade slipped between ribs. To win his sympathy. To secure his protection for financial reasons. Another pause. It would be a terrible thing if someone were to say so publicly. At an assembly. Where it couldn't be taken back. Eleanor looked at her sister. Clara stood, smoothed her skirt, and smiled the way she had smiled at the banquet, full, warm, and entirely without kindness. Friday, then, she said. I do hope you find something appropriate to wear. She left. Eleanor sat in the silence of her room and looked at the single broken pearl she had placed on her dressing table, the one the Duke had returned to her in a folded cloth, the one she had kept without entirely knowing why. Clara was going to call her a fortune hunter. In public. In front of everyone. And Eleanor did not yet know how to stop her. And there it is. The thing Eleanor feared most, not poverty, not humiliation, not even loneliness, was someone taking the one thing that had survived everything this family had done to her. Her honesty. Her dignity. Her word. If London believed she had pursued the Duke for his money, nothing he said or did could fully repair it. And Clara knew that. Clara had always known exactly where to cut. The final act is where everything comes to a head. The assembly. The accusation. And the Duke's response, which will not be what Eleanor expects. But here's what I need you to sit with before we get there. If the Duke stands beside Eleanor publicly after this accusation, does that help her, or does it make Clara's story look true? Eleanor is already asking herself that question. And she doesn't have an answer yet. Chapter 5. What remains? Lady Forsyth's assembly was smaller than the banquet. That was the word people used, smaller, as though scale were the operative difference, as though the same cruelty arranged in a more intimate room became something else. 24 families rather than 200. Candlelight from a single chandelier rather than 30. The same silk gowns, the same cold assessments, the same careful architecture of who stood where and why. Eleanor arrived in her best remaining gown, a deep blue she had preserved at the back of the wardrobe for occasions that required it, and she wore nothing at her throat. No pearls. No substitute. Just the clean line of her collarbone and the decision she had made that morning, standing before her mirror, that bear was more honest than borrowed, and she was done with things that were not what they claimed to be. She had barely crossed the threshold when Clara found her. It was done very well. Eleanor would grant her that. Clara moved through the assembled guests toward her with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable in rooms like this one, Lydia a half-step behind, and she stopped just close enough that the nearest cluster of guests could not avoid hearing without obviously retreating. She looked at Eleanor's bare throat. Her smile arrived slowly, the way winter does, not all at once, but incrementally, each degree colder than the last. Eleanor. Her voice was warm, carrying, perfectly calibrated for the radius she intended. You look lovely. Although, a small pause, a small tilt of the head, I notice you've come unadorned tonight. The room did what rooms did. It stilled at its edges. Attention moved toward the sound of potential spectacle like water finding a crack. Lydia said nothing. She did not need to. Clara's smile became something else. Will you wear paste jewels again tonight, Eleanor? She said, light and pleasant and precise as a surgical instrument. Or has His Grace bought you real ones now? Stop. Feel that. The room waiting. 24 people holding the particular stillness of an audience that has been given exactly what it came for. Eleanor has been in this position before, at the center, in the light, with nothing between her and the judgment of people who have already decided. But something is different now. Can you feel it? The difference between the woman who knelt on that marble floor and the woman standing here tonight. Because Eleanor can. She did not shrink. She stood in the full light of Lady Forsyth's chandelier, in her blue gown with her bare throat, and she looked at her sister with the calm, clear-eyed composure of someone who has already survived the worst version of this moment and knows, with complete certainty, that she can survive this one. "The pearls your family provided," Eleanor said, her voice even, unhurried, carrying its own quiet distance, were exactly as genuine as the kindness behind them. "A beat. Which I think answers your question." The silence that followed was different from the one at the banquet. That silence had been the room enjoying her fall. This one had a different quality, uncertain, recalibrating, the sound of people who had prepared to watch one thing and were now watching something else. And then, from the doorway, Miss Ashcombe. She had not known he would come. That was important. She had not arranged it, had not sent word, had not in any way constructed what was about to happen, and she would know that later, would return to it, would hold it as the fact that mattered most. He was simply there, the way he had been at the banquet, with that same unhurried self-possession, and he had heard enough. He crossed the room. He did not look at Clara with anger. That was what struck the assembled company, she thought, that there was no drama in it, no raised voice, no performance of masculine authority deployed for effect. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at something he is assessing fairly and finding wanting. Calm. Accurate. Final. "The necklace Miss Ashcombe wore to my banquet," he said, addressing not Clara specifically but the room in general, with the ease of a man accustomed to being listened to, was given to her by her own family. She did not choose it. She wore it because she was given nothing else to wear. A pause. He let that settle. Those false pearls were the only honest things in that room. His voice was level, each word placed with the precision of someone who does not need volume to be heard. They revealed exactly who everyone was. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Clara's smile had gone. What remained was the expression underneath it, and it was a much smaller thing, diminished, exposed to air it had not been designed to survive. Lydia had taken one precise step backward, the instinctive movement of a woman recalculating her position. The room, which had spent weeks enjoying the story of Eleanor Ashcombe, was now doing what rooms like this eventually always did, it was looking for the new arrangement. Deciding who stood where. Revising. Eleanor watched it happen. She felt no triumph. Only the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of a weight lifting from somewhere she had stopped noticing was strained. He turned to her. And this time, there was nothing formal in his expression. No performance, no careful social calibration. Just a man looking at a woman he had made his decision about and asking her to confirm it. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Will you dance with me?" Eleanor looked at him. "You're not rescuing me this time," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "No," he said. "I'm not." She took his hand. That is the difference. At the banquet, she had taken his hand because refusing would have cost her more than accepting. Tonight, she took it because she wanted to. Do you feel the distance between those two moments? 3 months. A broken necklace. A folded cloth with a split pearl inside. A man who came back not once but consistently, without performance, without agenda. That is how trust is actually built. Not in grand gestures. In Thursday afternoons. In returned fragments. In someone who keeps showing up the same way every time. He gave her the pearls a week later. A single strand, real this time, warm white, with a weight that announced itself the moment she held them. A simple clasp. Nothing excessive. The jewelry of a man who understood that Eleanor Ashcombe did not need to be decorated. She held them for a long time. Then she set them on her dressing table. She did not put them on. Instead, she opened the small drawer at the table's corner and took out what was already there, a split bead, chalky white, cracked cleanly in half. She placed it beside the new strand and looked at them together for a moment. She put the broken pearl in her small evening bag. The real ones she would wear another night. Tonight she wanted to remember what it had felt like to stand in Lady Forsyth's drawing room in a blue gown with a bare throat and refuse to be made small. To remember that she had already answered Clara before he arrived. To remember that the woman who had knelt on the banquet floor and the woman who had stood in that drawing room were the same woman, and that the difference had not been the Duke of Blackthorn. It had been her. A month later, Eleanor walked into a ballroom. Not Blackthorn's. Not Lady Forsyth's. A new room, a new evening, the kind that came, she was learning, when your life has shifted its axis and you are still adjusting to the new angle. She wore the real pearls. She wore the blue gown. She walked through the doors on the arm of the Duke of Blackthorn, and the room turned, that inevitable social motion, the instinct toward importance, and looked at her. Not at him. At her. Eleanor Ashcombe, who had arrived at the most important banquet of the season in mended gloves and a borrowed necklace. Who had knelt on a marble floor while 200 people decided what she was worth. Who had stood in a drawing room 3 months later and looked her sister in the eye without flinching. She did not look for Clara in the crowd. She did not look for Lady Marwick, or for Lydia, or for any of the faces that had watched her fall and found it entertaining. She simply walked forward. And from that night forward, whenever society spoke of the Duke of Blackthorn's banquet, they no longer remembered the fake pearls because they were false. They remembered them because they revealed the truth. The end. Or rather, the beginning of a different story. The kind that doesn't need to be told, because some things are better lived than narrated. Eleanor kept the broken pearl. She never did explain why. But if you've been listening, really listening, from the beginning of this story, you already know.
Subscribe for more interesting Duke-related stories.